Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Burrington. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for joining the Emerging Professionals Building Your Toolbox series. Today, we are going to be talking about brownfields. We will be using a real life example to explain brownfields. We've got panelists from Minnesota DEED, Stantec, and Braun today, who will be discussing brownfield and answering those tough questions that you may not be asking in other scenarios. So today, what is a brownfield? The U.S. EPA defines a brownfield as real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Essentially, a brownfield site or abandoned and unused property that is blighted by real or perceived environment contamination. I would like to introduce our panelists who we have today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves separately. So I'm going to start with Meredith.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meredith Udoivak, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Community Finance at DEED. This program, along with our redevelopment program and infrastructure programs, the Small Cities program, is housed within the Community Finance Office. Prior to my current position, I actually administered these programs, so they're sort of near and dear to my heart. I think they're great programs. They do a lot of beneficial funding opportunities for communities that have brownfield sites. And I'm happy to be here today. Thanks for having me.
All right, next we will do Justin.
Happy Thursday, everybody. I'm Justin Michael with Braun Tech. I'm a senior consultant over here, and I work primarily on our investigation remediation division projects here at Braun Tech.
All right, and Heidi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Pepper with Stantec, engineering architecture multidiscipline firm. I'm a senior funding specialist at Stantec and lead our North America funding program for US East.
Great, thank you. So some of the common brownfield contaminants that you may see in your communities would be a former gas station, a dry cleaner, any abandoned factories, lead and asbestos that would be in something that would consider a brownfield contaminant. So how do you know if your site is a brownfield? We're going to let our panelists go into that a little bit more. And as you know, brownfields are opportunities. They are things that you can clean up and make into a wonderful project. So we're going to dive right into the case study. So this is the Hilger transfer site. It's located in Maple Grove. It was a former landfill. It had quite a bit of significant contaminants that were unknown. About 183,000 tons of debris was removed from this site. DEED did award the city around $828,000 for funding for this project. And as you can see, the top picture was the before and the bottom was the after. And what happened was they constructed a 2,000 square foot industrial building, which ended up creating 300 jobs. Justin has the most experience with this project, so I'm going to let him start off by talking about how did you know this site was a brownfield and what were the first steps in getting this project off the ground?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so this project kind of got its start through the city of Maple Grove. They had acquired the property in the early 2000s after it had been vacant and unutilized for a period of time. And they knew for a while that they wanted to create some kind of positive reuse of this property. And knowing that it had been used, they knew just from being in the area, being the local government unit, that the site had previously been used as a waste transfer station and sand and gravel mine. And because of that, they knew there was potential for some waste and potential contaminated materials on the property. So they had engaged initially a consultant that happened to be Braun Intertech to do some initial exploration work as part of their due diligence to kind of assess kind of what they had in their hands. And that's kind of where things started off is we started to identify, pockets of contaminated soil, primarily composed of various solid wastes, buried solid wastes, and other trace chemical contaminants. So all that kind of drove the bus in starting to identify what costs would be to kind of repurpose this site for a beneficial new use. And they kind of always had in mind this industrial complex that kind of came to fruition here in 2019, 2020. So that's kind of where things started. they identified early on that there was potential here at this site, and kind of circumvented some of the normal due diligence activities that you would maybe see if you were just trying to assess initially if your site is a brownfield. Some of those things are, engaging in a consultant, maybe doing some of your own research. Is there a previous business use that you would suspect to have had handled materials that are, potential contaminants if mishandled or disposed of improperly at a property? So that's kind of thing where things started. Investigation proceeded at the site for several years by the city of Maple Grove until they engaged and awarded a developer the development agreement or contract for the site to redevelop into the industrial facility, which then resulted in some more development specific investigation, culminating in budgeting and cleanup plan for the project, which facilitated the eventual application to deed for cleanup funds. So it's kind of quick and dirty, but it was almost 15 years of work between the city of Maple Grove and their developer to kind of get things teed up for the site to apply for cleanup funds and then enact in a cleanup, which is, it's not typical. It's a pretty big project, and it's a project that required a lot of thought.
Now, you mentioned there's tools. So what tools would we use as city officials, city employees to determine if that site is a brownfield? Can you dig a little bit deeper into that? And
Yeah.
Meredith and Heidi, feel free to comment on that as well.
Absolutely. So, beyond engaging in a consultant, there's plenty of online tools these days, online maps, photographs that you can use to kind of start to ascertain whether there's potential risk at a property that you're looking at or potentially becoming involved with. Here in the state of Minnesota, we have great access to things like historical aerial photographs that can tell you a decent amount of previous land uses, previous occupants. Things like online historical society information can tell you about previous businesses. I've seen a lot of dry cleaners be identified via this case because, either there's not great city directory coverage, whatever, addresses change, all that kind of stuff. And it becomes a useful information that's available to anybody. So.
If I could just add, you mentioned the online tools. One online tool that we use quite a bit is MPCA's What's in My Neighborhood. So if you just Google MPCA, What's in My Neighborhood, and then you can drill down into your community and even further, and it gives you all that history of former uses, if there was anything that was ever, and then the status of it was, is it still pending? Is it closed? So then that can kind of lead you into areas in your community where there's more suspected or known contamination.
Yeah. So what Heidi's bringing up is a great online resource that the state runs and maintains that's specific to identified business uses or contaminated sites. So it's not going to tell you about something that hasn't previously had some kind of known regulatory participation.
And on the funding side for that, we have tools that can help pay for that. I know the Hilger site that we're talking about, they did the investigation prior to coming into us and only asked us for cleanup dollars. But if you're particularly, we see this from smaller communities in greater Minnesota that might not have the money to go through and do this investigation to find out what you have on your site. We do have money available that you can apply to us to do a phase 1, which is all this kind of historical data, as well as get into the phase 2 and drill some holes and figure out exactly where the contamination might be and develop a cleanup plan for that site. So we do have money available to help you out on the front end.
And also a good partner with that would be the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. With deeds funding, the US EPA also has a brownfields assessment grant program to do just what Meredith talked about, do an inventory, phase 1, phase 2, remedial action plan. Is that what RAP stands for?
Yeah, response action plan here in the state.
Yes.
It varies. It's all the same thing, but you'll see it different across every state.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about timing on projects like this. You mentioned the investigation and all the phases. Is there a general timeline on these projects, or is it really project based by each project individually?
Yeah, typically, you want you want to give yourself some time if you're thinking about redeveloping a brownfield, or think you might have a brownfield that you would also like to pursue assistance via some kind of public funding source, like deeds, cleanup funds, or whatever else, like US EPA's brownfield grants. They require time, and especially nowadays as the grants become more and more competitive, a lot of a big portion of the scoring for these grants is just project readiness. So you need your project to be shovel ready, and you don't want to play around with having delays in your schedule, and that impacting your project success, and ultimately jeopardizing your cleanup award if you do get that far. So.
Yeah, I would echo that. We're competitive, very competitive and oversubscribed. So the more ready you are, the better you're going to score. But you really kind of need to have a development plan in hand, because in order to get a response action plan approved, a lot of those cleanup plans are driven by what the development's going to be. If you're doing housing, you got to clean up more contamination off that site than if you're going to do a slab on grade industrial facility. So without having an idea of what your development's going to be for that site, and Heidi and Justin, you can probably talk to this more. You really got to kind of know, because otherwise you really can't do a cleanup plan without knowing that development. So the development really kind of comes first before you can really start much of anything.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you got to have an idea in mind right off the bat. And typically what we see is at least 12 months before, you're projecting to start work. You have a concept plan or very close to developing one, and you're engaging consultant as well with the identified property. So to kind of get yourself lined up for going after grants, and that's a pretty fast schedule, a year. So.
And one nice thing about the US EPA assessment grant program is that can help fund the planning component. So that could be one of the earlier steps that a community takes, is applying for that program. Again, very competitive, oversubscribed as well. But that, kind of gets you, can help you get you into a direction to have that development and use plan in place to pursue the cleanup funding.
There's a great question in the chat about phase 1 and phase 2. Could you explain a little bit about that process and what is involved in a phase 1 and a phase 2, and what is it?
Yeah, I saw a good response in the chat as well, and yeah, it is a desktop review. It's purely just looking at well, it starts with the desktop review, excuse me, but you're looking at historical land uses through available resources, either online or through other public records, interviewing knowledgeable people about the property of concern, and then conducting a visual survey, an in-person survey of the property, to identify any or distinguish any other potential areas of concern or sources of release, stuff like that. So it is really your initial kind of litmus of, do we need to do more? Do we have a reason to be concerned? And it's a requirement for owners or future potential property owners to begin to secure innocent landowner protections for themselves. So it's another important component.
Perfect. Another question that was asked is, where does the waste material go?
That can depend. Depends on the economics of the project and the waste. A lot of times for common solid waste here in Minnesota, they end up going to the landfill, to a permitted landfill, most often, or commonly, I should say. But in other cases, the waste can be retreated either on site or another facility, and potentially, beneficially reused. So it just depends on what the material is, what its characteristics are, and kind of what the economics of finding another use for it turn out to be.
And in some cases recently, and I know Braun, you guys were involved in this on another project in Fridley, is kind of just keeping some of that waste material on site. If you can put it under a building, so it's kind of contained, so moving that around. So there's some really good cost-effective measures that you can take if you get yourself a good consultant that has some experience and can kind of come up with those non-traditional kind of ways to get rid of the waste and sometimes can stay on. I know with this project we're talking about, the reason it came back in for a second round of funding, we gave them 2 rounds of funding, was because as they were digging, Justin, I think you guys ran into some, we call it the black goo, that nobody knew what it was, and everything had to sort of stop and halt to try to figure out what was this new bit of stuff that they had found. And you guys actually came up with an innovative way to treat that on site before removing it off, which took some time to figure that out, because it was, I mean, you can speak to this, something no one knew what it was.
Yeah, it was an unknown, uncharacterized material, which, you know, frankly is often the case with, you know, random wastes that are discovered in the ground. It's not necessarily just a clean product of any one kind, and so it requires some characterization and then thought to deal with it. Yeah, you know, there are certain times where keeping certain contaminants or wastes on site are appropriate when you can control exposure pathways. Something like this black goo that was found on the Hilger site, that's not one you want to really leave around due to its, you know, potential risk to the property and future occupancy. And so it was dealt with and managed and treated on site before being shipped away. So.
And that said, I would stress it's really important to get yourself, if you're doing these brownfield sites, a consultant that has some experience with this, because there are always unknowns. These are like snowflake projects. None of them are the same.
Yep.
Every single one of them is different, and it'll save you time and probably money in the end if you make sure that you're contracting with a consultant that has a good track record with working on brownfield sites.
Sure. Can you explain to us what it means to treat contamination?
Yeah, so to use the Hilger site as an example, we had this this black goo material that was some kind of petroleum derivative waste, mix of probably various petroleum derivatives that we ended up treating via chemical treatment, thermal degradation by a metal reagent that stabilized some of the contaminants, drove off some of the others, and allowed us to then dispose of it at a facility that could accept waste of that kind. So, because previously it was too contaminated, too potentially hazardous for a lot of people to dispose of or treat at another facility. So.
There's a question that was asked in the chat. Is there a difference between cleanup for residential and industrial? Yeah,
there are. So residential sites need to be cleaned up to essentially below background threshold values. They're the most conservative cleanup standards that are in place here in Minnesota for the most part. Industrial sites have a slightly higher threshold for cleanup goals in general. So,
is there a way of deciding or determining when a site has been completely cleaned of contaminants and you're ready to go?
Yeah, so there's a couple different methods there. So, in the state of Minnesota, we have this great program called the pollution control that the pollution control agency runs, called the voluntary investigation cleanup program and the petroleum brownfields program. So they're 2 separate programs for 2 different classes of contaminants, but both of those programs have assurances that you can gain after successfully completing a cleanup, either to appropriate cleanup standards, or if you're a responsible party or something like that, or just for whatever reason you have the motivation, you can go as far as receiving a certificate of completion if you're doing complete removal of all contamination and you prove that. So the state does offer some assurances that allow you to kind of get some kind of closure or clean bill of health.
How about any vapor mitigation? Is that a standard for most projects?
It's not standard, certainly not, but it has become a hot button issue in the regulatory environment these days. And it since I'd say the early 2000s, it's really become more and more common for sites with mobile or volatile contaminants to need vapor mitigation where it's not feasible either due to offsite contamination or deep widespread volatile contaminants in order to protect future occupancy and then not break the bank trying to chase out contamination. Vapor mitigation systems become a very good engineering control to bring a property to a new and beneficial reuse.
Great.
So, and then just to expand on that, vapor mitigation system can take a few different forms, but a lot of times because it's easiest and some people are familiar with it, they're very common or similar to a radon mitigation system. It's kind of same principle.
Meredith, there's a question for you regarding the application process, timing of awards, and reporting. Could you go a little bit into that, please?
Yeah, sure. We run grant cycles every 6 months. So for our contamination cleanup or investigation grants, we run those at the same time. They're due either May 1st or November 1st. We have about $4 million that we give out each grant round. Once we try to flip those around really fast, because as you know, there's 6 months later, plus we've got other programs. So if you apply in May, you'll know by the end of June, beginning of July, if you're going to get grant funding. We try to turn those around really quickly. You can get more than one grant. This project we're talking about is a prime example of that. They got one grant, they found out they had more stuff, they came back with those additional costs, and we awarded them funds again. What we'll do in our ranking process is take the previous award and add it to what you're asking for now so that we have a larger dollar amount. So those kind of cost overruns, we tell you to like try to make sure you don't do that unless there's unexpected things, like in this case it happened, because you're not always guaranteed to get additional funding. And we do our ranking based on what the development's going to be. So in the case of this project, it was an industrial development. There's a lot of jobs, high paying jobs and high taxes. And those are jobs and taxes are the biggest things that we look at. So if you have a project that hits those high, you're going to score very well. So this project had no problem getting a second round of funding from us. There is annual reports that you have to do. We will be on your tail to try to get that money spent and out the door, because if we're running grant awards every 6 months, you can imagine that our caseload like piles up really quickly. So we try to make sure you're moving along. Timing of your project is really important. That's something that we look at closely when we're determining who we're going to give grant funds to, because if you're not ready to go, we want the money out the door quick and we want to get these projects moving along. So that's another big factor. If your project needs to be pretty teed up when you come in and ask for funding from us. But yeah, it's pretty, I think, straightforward. Once you do your cleanup, you send in those invoices and we cut you a check. We pay on a cash needs basis. So as you incur costs, we send out money.
Great. How many applications would you say you receive a year?
Oh, a year? I would say we probably get maybe 60 applications a year. Probably about 30 a grant round can be typical. And just depending on again, it just depends on how many people are asking for how much money. We don't have a cap on the dollar amount that we can give out, but we can pay for 75% of your cleanup costs. So the local folks only have to come up with a 25% local match. And you can get some of that money from other funding sources. I know Heidi did a good presentation at our Brownfields and Beyond conference about some of the other non-state funds that are available that you can try to cobble some other sources together. 12% of the cleanup costs really has to come from the city. So, or the local folks. So we kind of keep some skin in the game, but otherwise the rest of that 25%, you can try to get from other funding sources that are out there. But there's no cap on the dollar amount except for the 75% is kind of the cost. So the program is to try to take away these extra costs of development on these sites because they can be very expensive. And it's an incentive for people not to continue to go out to the cornfield, but to take care of some of these sites that had previous uses on them. So that's part of the reason that the grant amount is pretty high at 75%. And there's a bunch of other sources out there for you to also tap into, because we realize that it's an extra cost of developing on those sites. And from a economic and kind of sustainable community and community development perspective, we want to make sure that communities are looking at the developed sites in their communities and not just letting them continue to degrade if they are unused and abandoned. They just cause more local problems than needed. So we're trying to provide an incentive to do something with those sites.
Yeah, and just to expand quick on Meredith's point, there's the other grant sources other than DEED. some of those become really important when you have contaminants that are things like asbestos in a building material, lead-based paint, coated products, because DEED typically doesn't supply funding for those kind of cleanup actions. So that's where your other cleanup funding sources become super important to kind of make a project viable.
Heidi, did you want to touch on a little bit more about those other funding sources that you've had experience with?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just reiterate the US EPA programs. We're anticipating the next round of US EPA brownfields funding, their notice of funding opportunity to come out in August with a deadline 60 days later, so probably like November. And they have a number of different programs within this overarching brownfields program. The assessment grant application, that does have a maximum, but there is no cost share required. So that is a popular one. And I will say that US EPA provides technical assistance to communities through most often universities. In our region, Region 5, they partner with KSU TAB. And so they will provide guidance to communities who are interested in applying to that program. Additionally, depending on the project, you could access US EDA, the Economic Development Administration funding. Again, if you can tie it to economic development, jobs, and tax base, as well as your comprehensive economic development strategy for the region. Potentially, you could secure community development block grant funds. So if you're an entitlement community, you receive those directly. If you're a smaller community, you would compete through DEED Small Cities Development Program. And then USDA Rural Development has some interesting programs as well. Again, on a case-by-case basis, you'd have to take a look at the current situation, what that intended end use would be for that area to maybe surface some additional funding programs.
Excellent. Meredith, the question for you again, are you seeing an increase in applications as developers are becoming more aware of brownfield developments?
Curiously, this program's been around since 1998 and it was oversubscribed then and it continues to be oversubscribed. I mean, there's just must be brownfield, there's urban fill everywhere. Like there's so many brownfield sites that are out there and people just don't even know. I would say it's been pretty steady. The market kind of directs what comes into us. We did see a big drop like when the recession happened in 2008 because everything went on halt and then there was no money available to do any development except for housing. So then we saw a ton of housing projects come in, which we can fund, but as the Economic Development Agency, we really get super excited about projects like the Hilger site that's got industrial development on it. And now we're seeing those come, kind of tick back up. So the demand has always been there. Sometimes it waxes and wanes with which kinds of projects are coming in that we really can watch the market and go, yep, that's why we're getting housing in because that's where all the money's, available right now and industrial development halts at some point, so as the market switches around, so do the kind of applications that we see come in, but they have been consistent over the years, which I am surprised with. Other programs at our department, there's a need, there's a program, and then we take care of the need and it kind of goes away. This program, we continue to have that need out there. And thankfully, we've had the funding that continues to come in to address those sites. I also, if I can add, saw a question about if you should call DEED before you're planning to apply for any of our programs. And yes, I would highly recommend that. We are always happy and excited to talk to people about projects that they have. So we can help you, position your application so that it maybe fares better in our application process, or maybe if it's something that doesn't fit our program, we can give you some suggestions of other places that you might want to tap into or tap into addition with what we're funding. So yes, by all means, if you have any questions, feel free to call us. If you are wondering about our application process, or even I'm not sure what to do, you can call us about that too, and we'll try to help you out with that as well.
Yeah, and questions about the application process, it's important to reach out to your local municipality, or if you are the municipality, kind of talk internally to anybody else that might have experience with any of the funding sources. Because a lot of times, the municipality has a plan in place or a process for preparing and putting together applications for these funding sources. And sometimes it requires extra lead time that may not, be consistent across different geographies. So.
Which is also a good point. Our money can only go to local units of government unless we do have some EPA money that's for a loan, which we don't talk about much because when we're trying to take away the extra cost of development, a loan you have to pay back. It doesn't really do that, but sometimes we can put a little package together. But aside from that program that can go to private entities, all of the money that we have goes to local units of government.
DEED can also loan to or provide funds to nonprofits, correct? Yeah.
Through the loan program, yes.
All right, so the city would have to be the applicant for that. There's a question about would tribes be allowed to apply for the DEED funds?
So there are not listed in our statute as eligible applicants. However, we've done project on tribal land before. So like, let's say in the case you're in Walker, City of Walker, the county, cities, counties, EDAs, HRAs are eligible applicants. So we certainly can do projects on tribal land, but the tribes themselves are not eligible applicants. But we've never had a problem with cities or counties being willing to step up and just basically run the grant and pass the money through.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about partnerships. Give some examples of partners you would see in a project like this, other than the city.
Sure. So you're going to have a developer in a lot of cases in their project team, the design team. So that's multiple disciplines. So everything from architectural, civil, environmental consultant, structural, you name it, right? Everybody has to come together to kind of design and conceptualize a project that one fits, the end goals and sometimes, makes the economics of the cleanup work out the best. There's a lot of people involved, and engaging communities, neighborhood groups in certain cases becomes super important because ultimately we're trying to provide a benefit to not just one site or one group, but to everyone in the community. So another
partner that should be included is the MPCA. When you do some of these, you're going to have to get your cleanup plan approved from them, but also they have assurances from legal liability that you can get if you're going to tackle some of these sites, which makes people feel a little bit more comfortable. Sometimes people will get their lawyers involved with that, not to make this sound like you need a lawyer to do this. You don't. The MPCA they're more than happy to help walk you through the process, but that is another thing that I would check into if you're going to take on a brownfield site. You're probably going to want to get some legal liability assurance to just show that you're not responsible for the contamination before you go ahead and buy that site and start moving dirt around on there. So they're another important partner in these projects.
Heidi, I'd be interested to know kind of your role in your organization with brownfields a little bit more.
Sure. Before I do, I want to address the applicant question related to EPA grants, just because I've talked a lot about them. Tribal governments are an eligible applicant. Additionally, there's a program just for states and tribes for capacity building through the EPA's Brownfields program. And then also with the assessment grant, the assessment can be done on public or private property, but the private entity cannot be the applicant. As you get into their cleanup program, then it needs to be on publicly owned property. But so my role within the company is working with communities who have a project but may not have all the funds in place. So helping to, take a look at what are the goals and objectives of the project, direct, indirect benefits, negative impacts of not doing the project, and then taking a look at what's out there at the federal, state, regional, in some cases, foundational levels to see what are the potential sources of funding out there that fit with their goals and objectives of the project. And just kind of helping to understand all of the various components. So, just because there's a grant program out there doesn't necessarily mean it's a program you should pursue. Depending on the dollar amounts and the dollar amount of the project you want to do, the timing may not line up. The requirements of the funding may be a bit intensive. So just considerations that communities need to think about before they even put pen to paper and apply to a program. So in a nutshell, and again, all of you on this call have the wherewithal to do what I do, but you probably don't have the capacity. So, and we're seeing and hearing ever more staff are being stretched thinner and thinner. So, yeah. And these programs, you know, as Meredith said, super competitive, you know, even with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, 1 point, however many trillion dollars that was. It's a lot of funding, but there is a lot of need out there as well. So you want to make sure that you're not just eligible, but that you're really competitive with your project. And, you know, state and federal agencies are more than happy to talk with you about your project. You know, Meredith said, call DEED. And even at the federal level, they have regional or in some cases state offices. So they're not far away in DC. You know, you should reach out to them. They're happy to talk to you about that because they, you know, they don't like turning people down, certainly. And the projects that they award, you know, this is truly a partnership because yes, their funding helps you move your project forward, but you having a good project with their funding really helps to maintain and potentially increase the funding that they get from whether it's the legislature or Congress.
Meredith had mentioned that she's seen, and there are a lot of brownfield sites in the state currently. Is there any discussion about increasing that funding in the near future?
No, I haven't heard any increasing funding. We do get substantial amount of money for this program considering like what other programs get, and we've had it for a long time. I would say, you know, competition is good. The projects that we award are really good projects that are ready to go. Usually the ones that we don't fund usually shouldn't be funded yet. And a lot of times they can come back 6 months later and then they're more teed up and then they'll get funding. So I feel like the funding amount, even though we're oversubscribed, is good, but I don't feel like there's projects that we're not able to fund that are just like, oh shoot, like this project's ready to go, just like the ones we're funding. They usually can wait. And if we would have awarded them, they probably would have waited 6 months before they would have started anyway. So I feel like the funding amount is pretty healthy. And at the legislature, it's always tricky whether you want to go back and open up your program and ask for more money, because then pretty soon they're like, wait, what program is this? Oh, hey, maybe we can take your money for something else. So we're kind of just quietly under the radar, humming along, and I think doing pretty well and hitting the big projects that we need to hit at the time that they apply.
The question for all of you. Is it the city or county's benefit to proactively treat contaminated sites, or is it more effective to have private developers lead that cleanup grant or process?
I would say the developer, because again, if the city wants to just go in, I really think it's really, I think almost impossible to do a shovel-ready site on a brownfield site because you don't know what the development's going to be. Therefore, you don't know what the cleanup plan is going to be unless you want to spend a whole lot of money and clean that site from sightline to sightline and dig it all out. And you probably didn't need to do that. And you probably spent a bunch of money that you didn't need to spend. So I feel like, and Justin and Heidi, don't know you think, I feel like it needs to be developer driven. But I do think in the case of this site that we're talking about, what was important is that the city identified this parcel as a redevelopment site within the city. So they kind of teed it up. They did the, you know, they agreed in the development agreement that they were going to take on helping to pay for the cleanup costs and finding resources for that, which I'm assuming made it more attractive for inland development to like apply for that RFP and take, because they knew they just had to do the development. The city was going to really take a lead role in helping with the cleanup plan. But I think that the development has to kind of drive it.
Yeah, it needs to be a team effort a lot of times. So it's not just, I don't think there's ever a scenario where the city needs to go in or a county, a public entity needs to go in and rehabilitate a property in order to kind of realize a eventual beneficial reuse. But and most often I think it just requires, a partnership. So.
If I could be the devil's advocate and not so much the devil's advocate, I agree with what you both said in terms of like the cleanup and the development as you move forward, but even to the left of that before you get to that. So the assessment piece of it. So you might be suspicious of potential contamination, or it could be known. There, I think it makes sense for the city or county to drive that, to really, you know, if there's a parcel or a corridor where there's been a lack of investment and people just, you know, developers aren't eager to develop there because there's so much unknown there. I think that's the place where cities and counties can lead the effort to find, you know, get your arms around what is there. And it may be fine, but that underlying assessment, I think, is a good role for communities to play.
Do you recommend doing any community outreach with projects like these?
Yes. I mean, Meredith, does DEED require community engagement as part of, I know at the federal level, community engagement is very important.
Yep.
And not just, you know, an open house or a public meeting. You really need to be intentional in receiving public input on your plan, your strategies, the implementation of it. A diverse group of stakeholders is very important.
Yeah, and a lot of the other local funding sources require community engagement, more in line with what Heidi's talking about.
Is there a timeline for that you could recommend? Or is it based on each community?
Yeah, it's a little outside my wheelhouse, and it certainly is going to be unique to, you know, every community's needs in the project, right? So
I would just say early and often.
Another question in the chat: how does the location affect cleanup if it's near a wetland, creek versus middle of the metro?
certainly having other environmental considerations beyond specifically addressing contaminants adds another layer of challenge. But you know, being rural versus being urban doesn't make a project more or less difficult. You know, costs can change because of geography, stuff like that. But the something like just using the wetland as an example, that's not necessarily going to drive contamination concerns unless there's something very specific going on there. So just kind of depends.
Meredith, have you seen anything, any additional comments on that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of times those cleanup plans or even the development plans that the city has, if it's near like a creek or a wetland, it's probably gonna have some effect on what the development's gonna be there. They're probably not, you know, making sure that it fits into their local planning process. But as far as the cleanup, I suppose if it's, you know, near wetland or water, you might have to do some additional measures or cleanups or berms or something to make sure that things are safe as we clean it up. But
Great.
But you would need to consider those kind of things at any construction project that may impact a wetland, right? So sometimes you have to beef up those controls, but for the most part, those should be considered a necessity anyways. Also just talk on to just going high level what the environmental due diligence process is in order to kind of gear up for a grant. So once you've identified a property and you kind of have an idea of a concept plan, we talked about the phase 1 environmental site assessment, which is your desktop and kind of initial visual review of the property, which can then lead to environmental investigation and sometimes a series of environmental on-site investigations. So when I call it an investigation, environmental investigation, typically means you're going out there and collecting samples of material, whether that be soil, groundwater, subsurface air, or soil vapor gas, and or building materials or buried materials. All those things need to be characterized to kind of start to get a handle on what the cleanup might entail, and then developing your response action plan or your cleanup plan once you feel like you have a good handle on what's going on at a property. And from there, you can start to develop cleanup estimates and start to engage with, further engage with, you know, the project members to develop a cleanup application. So.
What can private owners of contaminated land do to help the buyer or the developer interested in their property that may be concerned about their environmental liability?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I can tell you from our perspective, from our grant application, we always ask who owns the property and are they, who's the responsible party? Because if the state just goes and takes responsible parties off the hook with state dollars, then we're going to get in trouble. So usually this probably becomes a negotiation between the private landowner who is owning a piece of contaminated property and the developer. I would guess a lot of times you're going to get offered a less value for your property, or they're going to appraise it. And with the cost of the contamination on there, we often see a negative value. So you probably have a very, you're probably not going to make a lot of money trying to sell a piece of contaminated property if you have it. We've, in some cases, we had a project once in Winona where there was it was a business that owned the site and they were the responsible party and someone else wanted to buy it and clean it up. And so, the person who owned it said, well, fine, I'll just like put this huge mound of dirt on it because that'll contain it. And then my legal responsibility is gone. And then the city's like, well, then if we come in, we got to take all that off and then dig all the stuff out. And so that seems silly. So we worked out some, with them that made a little bit more sense. Like, why don't you have them just give you the cost of what that would, without putting that big berm on, and then we'll come in and clean it up afterwards. So that's why it's important to probably call folks ahead of time when you've got these, if some of them are kind of non-traditional projects, so we can kind of help figure out what makes sense rather than people spending money to cap a site and then we give you money to just take it away. That seems kind of silly, but usually if you own contaminated property, by the time you would do an appraisal on it, you're probably not going to be able to sell it for very much. Because usually they'll take the value of the land minus the cost of the cleanup, and then you usually get a zero or negative value of your property. So I'm going to guess the developer is probably going to be offering you very little money for your site.
I will add that it sometimes depends on the use. If you are a responsible party, so if you're responsible for the contamination, there are certain uses. Like if you own the site or owned the dry cleaner that operated on a site, there are funds in the state of Minnesota, at least, to kind of help you engage in cleaning up that problem. Similarly, a gas station. That is there are funds out there to kind of help assess and sometimes clean up those releases as a responsible party. But otherwise, if you're responsible or don't have the liability assurance to say that you did not cause the contamination on a property, it's pretty challenging. So.
Great. Anything else for you guys to add about brownfields? We're getting close to our end time here. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question, if you guys can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, so with kind of the emergence of the electric vehicle market, and that will possibly make gas stations obsolete, but obviously those are great pieces of real estate in a lot of times. How do you guys think about the future of those properties and the cleanup that will ultimately have to take place to reuse those properties if they're not needed for kind of gas stations down the road, if that makes sense?
Yeah, certainly. There's certainly some potential there that'll occur. It's really going to depend on what the market drives, the property use and other factors in certain geographies, right? So that's a complicated question.
Any other questions from the audience?
Can a site ever be too contaminated, or what's the kind of the point of no return? Is there a point of no return?
Maybe. I haven't seen it yet, though.
Chernobyl.
Yeah, but I mean, even then, you see that they're trying, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, we've seen projects from, needing a couple $100,000 to projects that need, $3 million grants from us. And I'd say a lot of those projects, if they're like no return, hopefully it's not a small site that's got a lot of concentration, but sometimes they're larger sites And then we asked them to come in kind of in development phases to make it a little bit more manageable for people to be able to have enough money to clean it up and do it in phases. Because typically you're not going to have one great big huge development. That's usually how they happen anyway. So there's ways that we can kind of tackle them.
There's a question about what is a super fund?
That's a regulatory designation. So that's referring to, and I shouldn't speak to this because it's a little outside of my wheelhouse. I don't deal with Superfund sites too often, but it's a regulatory designation underneath federal law pertaining to a site that has been listed on a national list of priority sites. So.
And usually they're the dirtiest of the dirties. I think if you end up on the Superfund list, you're a pretty big, very dirty site.
Are there any examples of those sites that you can think of? Off the top of your head?
Oh geez, the site in Fridley, the NIROP site, wasn't that a Superfund site at one time? It was on the Superfund list. And then I think that the users of that site, they used to make gun mounts for the Navy, I think it was very contaminated. It was on the Superfund list. And then they did some cleanup, and eventually as you do some more cleanup, it gets delisted or gets off the list. I think by the time we saw it come in and the city of Fridley was ready to, and that was a site that was very large and they did in phases. And I think Braun was involved in that. It was already delisted off the Superfund site, but still had contaminants on it that needed to be taken care of.
Yeah, there's usually a sequence of some sort of partial delisting on some of these bigger super funds. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? I'm seeing none from the audience, so we can end a few minutes early here. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your day to talk about brownfields, and thank you to everyone who attended today. Stay tuned for the next session. We will be sending out an email and information regarding that, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.